In Middle Ages Europe, getting a divorce was next to impossible, and the only way out of a marriage was the death of a spouse or annulment. A woman who sought annulment often had to bring a case based on her man's inability to perform his duties in bed. That often involved an awkward public examination in courts. Today we take a look at facts about the Middle Ages that made it so delightfully strange. If you haven't already, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more videos. In medieval times, divorce was frowned upon to such an extent that it was just about impossible to secure one. King Henry VIII spent years trying to get the Pope to annul his marriage. When that failed, he took England out of the Catholic fold, started his own Church of England with himself as its head, and got out of his marriage that way. For those who were not kings, things could be even trickier. In France, just about the only legal grounds to get out of a marriage was if a husband couldn't get it up. To defend themselves from charges of impotence, defendant husbands would have to demonstrate that they could get an erection in a courtroom in front of witnesses and legal experts, to the satisfaction of women appointed by the authorities to check. However, there was an alternative to making a husband prove his virility in public by expelling reproductive fluids on demand. Apart from the awkward courtroom physical, couples who wanted out of marriage and wanted to settle things could face off in a divorce duel. Since men had the physical advantages, efforts were made to even things out. Husbands armed with 3 clubs had to fight from inside a waist-high hole about 3 feet wide, with one hand tied to their body. Wives were armed with 3 rocks that weighed up to 5 pounds, tied in a cloth like a battery in a sock, and could move around the hole freely. Both sides' weapons had to be of equal length. If the husband touched the edge of the hole, he forfeited a club, and if he did so 3 times, he would have to continue unarmed. If that happened, he would presumably have to try and wrestle her into the hole before she bashed his head in. The duels were surprisingly fair, and there are numerous accounts of women coming out victors. Although middle-aged divorce duels were not fought to the death, it was the ultimate result. If the wife won, her husband was executed, and if the husband won, the wife was buried alive. One of the more colorfully named middle-aged diseases was St. Anthony's Fire, also known as Holy Fire. The affliction was named after the monks of the Order of St. Anthony, who were particularly successful at treating those struck by the disease. Modern medicine knows it as ergotism. It was a horrible illness that caused great suffering. Caused by fungus that grows on moldy grains, especially rye, St. Anthony's Fire produced swelling, redness, and gangrene in those whom it afflicted. Sufferers often hallucinated and sometimes imagined that they were in a fight with Satan. As the disease progressed, convulsions occurred, extremities began to rot, and ears, fingers, toes, and even arms and legs began to fall off. In 944, about 40,000 died from an outbreak in France. St. Anthony of Padua was a Portuguese Catholic priest, noted by his contemporaries for his powerful preaching, expert knowledge of scripture, and undying love and devotion to the poor and the sick. He was one of the most quickly canonized saints in church history. He was proclaimed a doctor of the church by Pope Pius XII. St. Anthony became sick with ergotism and died on June 13, 1231, at the age of 35. The Middle Ages were rife with contagious diseases. Between poor sanitation, lack of adequate hygiene, and overcrowding, urban dwellers were most at risk for contagions that swept through with great speed. Such health risk factors made the era quite dangerous, coupled with mediocre standards of medical care and knowledge, and it is unsurprising that life expectancy back then was abysmally low. Among the worst diseases was leprosy, which devastated sufferers' health as well as their social status. A little misunderstood disease even today, leprosy carried a huge stigma in the Middle Ages. Lepers were shunned and cast not just out of cities but even from the smallest settlements. The stigma did not end with death, but carried through into the afterlife, as lepers were denied burial alongside non-lepers. Peasants back in the Middle Ages were placed at the bottom of the social pyramid as a lower caste, that had fewer legal rights and protections than the nobles and clergy above them. Moreover, a significant chunk of the fruits of their labor went to support their social bosses. Medieval peasants were often bound to the land and unable to leave without the proprietor's permission. Peasants were required to put more time and effort to tend an aristocrat's field than their own. In medieval times, people did not work very long hours and the pace of work was relaxed. A 13th century adult peasant worked an average of 1,620 hours annually. A typical workday stretched from dawn to dusk. The labor could be backbreaking, but there were many breaks for breakfast, lunch, and an afternoon nap and dinner. After a harvest, peasants enjoyed up to 8 weeks of slack-off time. Without counting all the holidays and religious feast days, between slack time and holidays, a medieval peasant got away with only 150 workdays and a good harvest a year. In medieval times, peasants were the lowest of the low. Across England in particular, villages, towns, and other settlements would select a Lord of Misrule from the local peasant population. The chosen man, and it was always a man, would quite literally live like a king for the day before going back to his abject life of toil and poverty. In most cases, the Lord of the Manor would choose that year's Lord of Misrule. The chosen peasant would dress up in a colorful costume and fix bells to their arms and legs. They would then dance around their village, often making their way to the nearest church in time for Mass. The Lord of Misrule could also order a feast to be laid on for his fellow peasants. In fact, this was often the only time of the year the lower social class got to eat and drink well. In England, King Henry VIII banned the Lord of Misrule in 1541 as he clamped down on the church and all of its traditions. Though Queen Mary I brought it back, it was banned again under Queen Elizabeth I. Winters were tough for peasants in the Middle Ages. Poor quality housing and clothing made the cold weather almost unbearable, with many dying from the cold. But that doesn't mean that peasants didn't like to have a little fun. Once the temperatures started to plummet, the village peasants would grab their makeshift skates and head to the nearest pond. In most cases, these skates were fashioned from ordinary leather shoes or sandals, with a carved piece of animal bone attached to the bottom. Since animal bones have an oily surface, this allowed the wearer to glide across the ice. From the 14th century onwards, skates with metal blades started emerging. These transformed ice skating as a leisure activity. Since only those with good levels of disposable income could afford these new skates, having fun ice skating increasingly became a middle or upper class activity. Since Tinder wasn't available in the medieval times, people had to find other ways of getting a date, ideally a husband or a wife, and they liked to have fun while matchmaking and dating. One of the most popular ways of finding the one was bobbing for apples. A bunch of apples left over from the harvest were collected. Each one was given the name of a single man from the village. The apples were then placed in a bucket, and the village maidens then tried to take the apples out using just their mouths. They would get only 3 chances. If she managed to get the apple out on the first try, then tradition held that the couple were meant to be together forever. If she needed 2 attempts, they would wed but have a troubled marriage. If she needed 3 tries, then the union was deemed to be doomed from the start. Courtship among peasant societies was the same across Europe. A young man and woman would court publicly, usually meeting at markets, at church, or in the fields whilst working. The man would usually try and woo her with gifts of food or clothes. Thank you for watching this video, and see you in the next one.